What are the steps when we actually do our literature review? The first and the most important step is to define a problem. And your problem should not be too wide, but maybe not too narrow. For example, you're interested in anxiety. You type the word anxiety in your search box and you get 10,000 different papers. Completely impossible to review. Anxiety in adolescence, a little bit better. Maybe you get 2,000-3,000 papers, but also impossible to review. But if you say test anxiety mathematics, then your search will be fairly specific, and maybe you will see a couple of hundred papers that are feasible to review and to kind of generalize on. And obviously, if you find some existing reviews or meta-analysis, these are going to save you a lot of effort because some people have already done the work for you. The second tip that I would like to share is try to set your questions, formulate your questions before you start conducting your review. What it is that I want to learn about test anxiety associated with mathematics. Maybe what kind of individual personality characteristics are associated with it. Or maybe what are the consequences of test anxiety for performance. If you set these questions, you'll know what you're looking for and it will save you some time. The third step is to choose a strategy of looking for your sources, and we'll take a look at those strategies and make sure you spend quite some time. Allow yourself some time to download papers, to read papers, to shuffle, to choose. You might want to make abstracts, or you might want to place these papers into different folders, or create a separate file with abstracts, or write those abstracts on little pieces of paper and put them on the floor to help you structure this whole field. And once you establish a structure, you might try to arrive at some conclusions and you start writing up, and in the process you also analyze and generalize. So it works like this, but make sure you allow yourself some time to explore the sources before you start writing up, because otherwise it's very easy to fall into some narrow direction and actually ignore some other lines of thoughts or ideas. And of course, most references that you will find might actually be completely irrelevant to your work, and you might not want even to include them in your reference list. And typically we use abstracts to decide. You don't need to read everything that you download. You can just skim or browse through the papers, but your goal is to find those 2 important papers that are really relevant for your master's thesis. A paper written by your advisor 10 years ago, and one your advisor had forgotten to tell you about. Because maybe they also did a lousy literature search. Don't do it. What kind of sources can we use in our reviews? There are obviously peer-reviewed journal papers and monographs and chapters, and there are research reports and there are dissertations where we can more or less trust the conclusions. But there are also some sources that have not been peer-reviewed, like abstracts or non-peer-reviewed journal papers, or maybe preprints, unpublished papers where it's not clear, maybe it will never get published because it's rubbish. So one important consideration is that the quality of any publication is not defined by the source where it's published. It's not defined by the name and status of the author. I've seen such awful papers written by doctors of sciences. Oh my God. The only criterion for the quality of publications is defined by the quality of peer review. A peer-reviewed journal paper or a dissertation has been evaluated by at least 3 people or even more: an author, an editor, and a reviewer. And usually there are 2 or 3 reviewers in journals and maybe sometimes several editors. So you can more or less trust that rubbish and nonsense did not penetrate that text to that extent that it would actually make it impossible to rely on. But in a non-reviewed journal, a paper might be evaluated by just one person, editor, who might just skim through it and yeah, maybe it's okay. Or even by no one. There are journals that publish anything and they're called rubbish journals. Unfortunately, they are around and they might look like scientific journals, but they are not. And with monographs, it's also very unpredictable because a monograph might be reviewed if it's a good publishing house like Springer or Wiley, but if it's a strange publishing house like Lambert Academic Publishing that publishes basically anything that you submit, it's not clear whether you can trust that publication. And the same with textbooks. If it's a good American textbook, for every chapter you see 2 or 3 people who reviewed this chapter. If it's a textbook, for example, Russian one, where people don't have finances to invite all those reviewers, unfortunately, sometimes there are errors. Sometimes Pupkin might misrepresent the theory of Freud. And a couple more life hacks. How to conduct a quick review. If you want to conduct a quick review, but systematic review, make sure you don't miss anything. My suggested strategy is to use Scopus. Why Scopus and not Web of Science? Because Web of Science is more oriented towards exact sciences and natural sciences, whereas Scopus also indexes some sources from humanities and social sciences. So Scopus is more comprehensive when it comes to our field. And the life hack is to enter some keywords and sort sources by citation count. Sources that are most cited are probably going to be most relevant. Either these are systematic reviews, people love to cite them because they don't like conducting reviews, or maybe some classical papers that established a paradigm, some seminal methods papers that everyone uses. So it's definitely important for you to go through those at least 20 most cited papers in your research area. And if your search terms are specific, probably you'll find a good starting point for your review. But obviously there are also other strategies. One important point about Scopus is that Scopus does not contain full texts. It only contains abstracts. And based on these abstracts, you decide whether you want to read it or not. It's irrelevant. Under every abstract, there is a button called HSE full text, which leads you to this paper in our subscription. Sometimes this button does not work. Then another strategy could be to look in our library catalog. Do we really have this journal for this particular year? If we do, it's good. If we don't, maybe you can use Sci-Hub. But Higher School of Economics subscribes to a huge lot of electronic resources. I think we spend more than $1 million a year for these subscriptions, and I would strongly recommend you to make use of this whole vault of knowledge, because few people are privileged, especially in Russia, to have access to this whole wealth of information. Of course, there is also Google Scholar, which is free, unlike Scopus. It's open, and it tries to index all openly available PDFs. So sometimes, if you don't have access to a paper, you can find it through Google Scholar because an author has placed it in some repository. And for Russian language work, unfortunately, Russian journals are not cited. Most of them are not yet cited in Scopus and Web of Science. So there is a separate database which is called Russian Index of Scientific Citations, or RINCS, elibrary.ru, which you can use to search for papers. There are also some PDFs there, so some journals really include full texts. So it's a fairly good resource as well. And just a couple of final tips on structuring your review. Some people sort papers in folders, some people create a file with abstracts, some people like drawing a mind map. So whatever your strategy is to structure your review, it's probably good enough if it works for you. The only suggestion that I would like to propose with respect to this is it is often good to present the future structure of your review to your supervisor. Like, this is chapter 1, this is what I'm going to talk about in this chapter in 2-3 sentences. This is chapter 2, and these are the sub-chapters, and in 2-3 sentences what I'm going to include. Because this way your supervisor might actually give you feedback on the logic of your future review, and it will be easier for you. You won't have to rewrite if this logic is not easy to grasp. Sometimes it happens that I write and I think my logic is clear, but the person who looks at it says, you need to restructure it a little bit. We don't want to do the work many times. So once you have completed your review, you can ask yourself a few questions. Does my review give sufficient information? about the way the problem I'm interested in has been studied? Does it take into account existing approaches, theories, and methods that people have used to focus on this problem? The second question, is my review a sufficient justification for my study? A good review is connected to an empirical study that follows, and it justifies this empirical study very clearly, that it's exactly this study that needs to be carried out and in this way. Unfortunately, sometimes bad reviews fail to provide this justification. And finally, is my review economical, concise, and is it structured and readable? Especially if you write a paper for a journal, try to make your review very concise, very to the point. Sometimes it's painful to exclude bits of text that feel like important because I wrote them, but unfortunately journals typically tend to have very strict requirements with respect to word count, with respect to the size of your paper that you can publish. So there is not much that we can do about it. We don't want to sacrifice the empirical part, which in an empirical paper is the most important one. So these are just a few tips concerning theoretical reviews and literature reviews, and I hope that these tips might be helpful for you during this year when you start writing your coursework, which is essentially a literature review for your future master's thesis. And now we can proceed to the next